Welcome to Restore the Glory podcast. My name is Jake Kim.
And I'm Bob Schutz.
We're two Catholic therapists sharing what we've learned personally and professionally to help you on the journey of restoration. Hey, Bob. Good to see you. We are back once again, as always, and today we're doing our once in a while episode where we respond to questions from our listeners. So listeners, thanks for sending in questions. Bob and I love to hear what's going on in your worlds and what you're wishing we would talk about. It helps us make decisions about topics and series and all that kind of stuff. So thanks. So Bob, we're going to dive in here.
I think we're ready, but some of the questions came in. We really were suggestions for series, and so some of those will be in series. So if your questions aren't being answered, they may be in later series.
Yeah, maybe we'll just quickly, I can go through that. We have plans to have on a guest who's an actual devout Catholic practicing psychiatrist. We hope to have her on to be able to talk about personality disorders and et cetera. We want to do a series on addiction. We have a series coming up on divorce. We want to do a series on infertility and dealing with pregnancy loss. A series on grief and loss. Those might connect to each other. Yeah. So those are just a few of the ones that we've gotten from you listeners. So cool. Good ideas. Thank you. All right, Bob, here's the first one. Somebody references Sister Miriam. That's always a good thing. So they're referencing on one of the podcasts we had with Sister Miriam, and Sister Miriam was talking about two parts of trauma, the experience of the trauma and then the feelings that you keep bottled up inside. And so one of the questions here is, it's actually from a dad, which is pretty cool. The question is, how can I cultivate an environment in our home where his three young sons can come to him if they've experienced trauma? We're trying to cultivate an environment of unconditional love. And I specifically want to encourage them to come to us with those experiences. I thought this was a great question.
That is a great question.
About parenting and what a cool dad trying to love his sons well. So you want to jump in first?
Yeah, sure. I would say he's already 3/4 of the way there just by his heart and desire for that, for the children. I think that's the biggest thing, just the awareness and the desire. I would just add a couple of things to that. One is, as you're doing that for yourself as a dad, and you're paying attention to your trauma and you're paying attention to the places where you've received that or haven't received that, I think that'll go a long way in terms of your sensitivity to your children in that. And I think the other would be to model it between you and your wife, that you're really attending to that in each other's hearts, so that as you're attending to that, your children become aware of the safety and it creates an environment to do that. Then I think the third is just simply saying to your children, if there's anything that you struggle with, we just want to love you and please share it with us, anything that is hard for you to deal with. And I think children then know whether it's safe enough in that environment.
Yeah, I agree. I love that the dad's already thinking about that. Like that's cool. Yeah. Good job, Dad. A few of the things that come to mind for me with regard to this, I was thinking the exact same thing. The more that we do our own work in any way, shape, or form, the more that we are sensitive to other people's work and the better we are in connecting with them. Like if I'm pretty good at seeing a lie within myself, I'm usually better at seeing it in someone else. And I would add on, the way in which I treat myself in my wounds often is how it comes out with other people. So in other words, your main homework and practice is internal. That's the number one work for me. Another couple little things I would say is depending on the age of your kids, it adjusts. Like the manner in which you relate to them adapts. So if they're really little, right, you have to use age-appropriate language, and a kid wouldn't understand a word like trauma, like if we're talking about a 4, 5, 6-year-old. Mm-hmm. Those kids are usually you can see what's going on pretty well because they don't have a ton of filters yet. But if they are really guarded, I would say that's something to watch out for. The other thing that I found as a dad, which something that I wish I had known way earlier, was this. My kids are always observing me, and they will observe how I handle situations that don't even feel like they matter. So for example, let's say somebody cut me off in traffic. That little experience, now times you can be frustrated and that's normal, but if I have a consistent response to people who do something wrong, my kid will internalize that and say, well, that's likely the reaction I'll get from dad. And that was very subtle because in some ways I did really good in this domain. And then I didn't think about, oh, right, they're watching me all the time, not just when I'm quote unquote on. And so my criticism or, whatever, I think really negatively affected my kids because I didn't think they were watching and it wasn't directly connected to anything having to do with their story or healing. So then when they have something or I bring it up, they're like guarded. And I'm going, why are you guarded?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh man, they watched me deal with this other situation or get frustrated about this other thing. So I think that's very subtle, but it's really important.
That's good. They're watching all the time and they're determining whether dad's safe or not safe and to the extent to which he's safe. And I think also the third podcast we did on emotions, we talked some about this, is what happens when a child gets hurt and they come and how do you respond to that?
Yep. The last thing I would say is make connection points normal so that these things come up naturally in conversations. If it's a one-off and you're just randomly having a deep and serious conversation, it doesn't work as well. So I would say things like regular dinners, regular touch points as a family that are normal and anything's allowed. So it could be fun or not. So we used to do a thing called Happy Crappy at dinner when the kids were there. And so it was a way for the kids to start sharing how their day went. That was a nice access point, and it happened every day, every meal, or every dinner. So it was normal. It wasn't like how are you doing? Right? With their, they're like, oh, this is weird. I don't know what to say, stuff like that. I would say the other thing is I learned was trust Heather's maternal instincts. It was amazing where Heather knew something was going on or there was a dynamic. I went, oh, it's no big deal. And she was like, nope, something's up. And I was like, learn to trust the maternal instinct. The feminine genius is pretty good here. So
good point.
Here was the next one here. Would you be able to just talk about loneliness? They reference some other things, desert fathers and the deadly sins and whatnot. But I just want to zoom it out a little bit to talk about loneliness. We will do an episode on acedia. That was this question jogged our memory about that, but later episode about acedia. So loneliness. Can we just talk about how loneliness, how it affects us, how it affects healing, etc.? One thing I can jump in with, which is something that has been a big deal for me. I don't know if this is universal, but a lot of men that I've shared this with have found that it resonates. I call it, I think I've shared it on the podcast before, something I call the triple threat. And when these three factors are present, it is like kryptonite to my soul. And the first one is I'm all alone. And what's interesting is that I've had to nuance that point, and I'll come back to that in a second. I'll list the three. So I'm all alone. I don't know what to do, but I have to get it right. So when those three factors are present, it is a bad combination for me. And I can get really emotionally distressed. Anxiety can go through. My wounds pop up, all kinds of just big time trigger. But to go back to that first one, I'm all alone. What I noticed is that I first said I'm all alone, but the reality is I'm rarely ever all alone. I have access, like, Bob, I could call you at any point. So I'm not actually alone. But the truth is I feel isolated and I'm ashamed to bring someone in. That's more of the accurate dynamic. So there's loneliness kind of going on there, but for me, it's I'm falling victim to the shame of needing someone. And so I don't bring them in. So then now I'm alone. And if I do that over a long period of time, that can lead to a lot of loneliness. That'd be one dynamic just to stir the pot here. The second one would be, this is a little off topic, but it connects. Let me just say the statement and we'll see if it makes sense. I think some people call themselves introverted and they actually have been wounded relationally And their introversion is a coping mechanism for wounds in relationships. I wonder that sometimes about myself. I think I am introverted, but man, there's some other times where it really is convenient for me not to have to, So that to me connects as well, because you could be having somebody dealing with loneliness, and actually what's going on is they're afraid of connection because connection's been difficult or not always gone well in the past. So those are things. I'm just throwing more stuff on the table. So I'll hit the ball back to you. What thoughts about this one?
Good. There's so many different thoughts here for me, so I'll try to organize them. One is we'll have just come through Thanksgiving and Christmas by the time this podcast comes out. And I think of all the people that I know that are going through Thanksgiving and Christmas and feeling the loneliness of not having connection, not having family, and so I think that in some there's a reality associated with it. But in these particular situations, there's also been a history of abandonment wounds. And, what's the chicken and the egg? Is it the abandonment wound that leads to isolation and loneliness? Or is it the loss of good community that leads to that feeling of loneliness and isolation? And how do they feed on each other? And so as you were describing about, those combinations and the wounds coming up, there's often kind of relational histories. I'm thinking of a couple of different people here, relational histories where there's just been this wounding back and forth, as you're mentioning. And it's just easier not to risk relationship. Yes. Yep. That being said, I'm thinking on the other side of the difference between loneliness and solitude. And, solitude is being at peace, being alone. And that's really because you're not alone, because there's the presence of God, because you're content in that place. And I think of my friend Father Burke, who you've had on the podcast, who talked about his archbishop at one point saying that loneliness is really a gift to grow in intimacy with Jesus. And so it moves from the woundedness of I'm all alone and there's nobody here for me to I'm not alone, as you're saying. Not even if I can't think of a person to reach out to. There's always I can reach out to Jesus there. And so if I will, rather than react to the loneliness by trying to get busy or an addiction or something like that, or grasping for connection, I can just walk into it and name it and identify, okay, where is this coming from? And Jesus, I need you here. And sometimes we can feel abandoned from Jesus in that, but that's, again, I recommend the healing process that we talk about of just starting with that and then walking back.
But there's a lot of good points you're bringing up there. I think you're emphasizing a spiritual discipline of solitude, which is an essential spiritual discipline. And what's interesting is that sometimes the disciplines trigger us. So reading something, a doctor of the church or, I don't know, just St. Francis de Sales or somebody like that, just reading their book and they say, you really need to do this. You're like, yeah. And then you go try it. And you're like, I don't like this. This is not good. He was clearly wrong, and what we don't realize is, oh man, that's triggering. Here's another one that Heather recently talked about on Abiding Together. Just shout out to we'll call them our sister podcast. They're our sisters. That Heather said, isn't it interesting how God's silence can really trigger the silent treatment we got as a kid? And I went, oh, that is really good. And the point, that's a really beautiful point. But if you apply it on a larger scale, whenever you're triggered, pay attention. And triggered is a negative emotional reaction that doesn't quite match the situation. So, Bob, if I started yelling at you and calling you the dumbest person in the world, right? That should bother you. But if I'm sitting here and I'm 5 minutes late for our call and you're like, Jake hates me. Okay, that's something's off there, so I'm just another example of triggered. We really need to pay attention to those triggers because there's something going on. So if I'm in solitude and I'm really scared and I'm agitated, irritated. Okay, we're probably dealing with something under the surface, like you said, an abandonment wound. Now we need to be going through the process. Secondly, sometimes God triggers us. And people go, well, what do I do then? I'm done, because you guys only talk about the healing, being with God. I would say, my spiritual director said this recently, and boy, what a bold statement on his part, but it was genius. He said, Jake, when you go to prayer, I want you to put my face onto God.
Yeah.
And he said, because he knew I trusted him implicitly. And so he goes, what would that be like? And I was like, I just calmed down. I felt at ease. I was like, wow, you're kind. You'd smile. We would laugh. It'd be normal. And he goes, yeah. So you might have to relate to me for a while to get used to that being like God. And I was like, man, that's cool. So anyway, how about we'll move on to the next one?
Yep, sounds good.
They would like us, I'm just summarizing here. Anxiety and scrupulosity. How do we understand them? Where do they come from? How do we get out of it? How can we help someone else? So anxiety, scrupulosity. Anxiety, that's a giant one. Scrupulosity, a little bit more specific, but want to take a first stab at it?
Sure. Yeah. Let me start with scrupulosity. Maybe let's take them separately. We'll do scrupulosity and then anxiety. I think it'd be easier, even though anxiety drives scrupulosity, but I think it'd be helpful to separate them. So knowing the people that have really struggled with scrupulosity, and I read in a book recently, it's actually a book I love, and it's by an author I love, Father Jacques Philippe, who made the statement of people who struggle with scrupulosity may always struggle with it. And, I just went, this is probably the first statement that I had a negative reaction to.
Sure.
Not that it isn't enduring unless it's dealt with, but what I found in scrupulosity is there's two things that drive it. It's fear and shame. And oftentimes early parental experiences of very harsh, angry parenting, which produces a sense of fear and a sense of shame. Like the fear is, if I don't do everything right, I'm going to get whatever that negative reaction is. And then that's going to turn into humiliation and shame for me. And so I've got to be good enough all the time, and I can't do anything wrong. And, I sometimes at Mass, I see the same woman get in confession every day, just my heart goes out to her. And it's just this place of whatever I do that I have to be perfect with, and I have to go back, and that was really what Martin Luther struggled with. He had a very harsh father, scrupulosity, and that was really what led to a lot of his theology to try to compensate for that scrupulosity, because he was going to confession all the time and just always in fear that he was always going to be under judgment, and it's kind of sad.
What would you take the next step with of how would one who's suffering from scrupulosity, what's the healing journey? What's the starting point? What might a path look like?
Well, I think there's two that are really important. And again, I'm not an expert in this area, but these are the two that I've seen that have been really helpful and people have shared with me. One is treating it as a phobia, resisting continuing to go to confession, resisting the compulsive act. And then that uncovers the anxiety, which we'll get into next. But that would be the first thing. And then second is to go and really do that exploratory work with the Holy Spirit, the healing process again of, okay, Lord, what is it I'm afraid of here? What am I ashamed of? Where is this rooted?
Yeah. Yeah, the thoughts that come to my mind is scrupulosity is one of those things that can slip through the cracks with a devout person, because it comes across and can present as devotion and commitment. But to me, one of the key indicators of scrupulosity is self-reliance, because there's way too much emphasis on me and not enough emphasis on God. And God only has a one-track mind in the sense of, if I do the slightest thing, I'm eternally damned.
Right.
That I'm overemphasizing a little bit there.
Yeah, but it's emotionally what it feels like.
Yeah, emotionally what it feels like. Yeah. And again, I think the thing we always have to remember is that God is a person with whom we relate. And so we're talking about relational dynamics, and that how the human person works is we are creatures that learn. And so when something happens 3 times before, we expect the same result the 4th time, especially if those first 3 things had high emotional intensity to them, whether it be good or bad.
Right.
And so if you had really highly critical parents, and I remember a client that I would work with, and she would be physically abused literally over spilled milk.
Mm.
And the terror and the panic in my client was just heart-wrenching. She was very scrupulous because her expectation was that God was infinitely more intense than her mother. And so it made so much sense where the scrupulosity came from, yet she didn't understand, not her fault, but she didn't understand the character of God. So she was managing her mom in the chair of God, and
Right.
that is brutal.
Right.
Like that's tough.
Yeah.
And so part of the healing process there is not only realizing the wounds that are present, but it's also getting to know who God really is. And that's a scary thing, but a super important one, is to actually understand the character of God. And I've also found with scrupulous people that when you offer a different perspective of God other than the one that they have, they're quick to reject it.
Yeah.
Because it elicits anxiety. Well, you're asking me to do something outside my comfort zone, and that's not good. Like that could be the death of me, So
yeah,
they go hand in
that
hand.
really brings up a lot of anxiety, which we need to deal with. But, scrupulosity is a form of perfectionism.
Yes.
And in that same book, Father Jacques Philippe, Searching for and Maintaining Peace, he makes the statement right after that perfectionism is not sanctity.
That's good.
That's
good.
In the delusion of the scrupulosity, there's a delusion that perfection, if I can be perfect, I can be holy.
Yes.
Where holiness is coming to receive the mercy and love of God in the places of our vulnerability, our weaknesses, our sin. They're 2 different things.
Yes. Yes. Do you want to hop over to anxiety now?
Yeah.
I remember doing a talk one time. I said the line, and of course I can't remember it right now. I'm pretty sure it's in one of Paul's letters, and maybe it's in a collect of one of the opening of the collect of Mass. But it says, "Be anxious over nothing," or "Let yourself be anxious for nothing," or something. It's sorry, I'm butchering it right now, but I remember saying that, and I had the reference, and I quoted it, and someone scoffed at it and interrupted the talk and just went, "Come on. That's ridiculous. Like, that's impossible. Why are you even suggesting this?" And I went, wow, this is really interesting what's happening right now. Someone is so bothered by the invitation to be anxious over nothing that they're like, I'm interrupting. You've gone too far now, Jake.
Yeah. It created such anxiety that it.
Yeah, I know that was kind of, I didn't point that out, but that was kind of ironic to me.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah. Which is, it's Jesus said it over and over again. And that was St. Paul, right? Be anxious over nothing, but in all things. And yet, when we start really trying to apply that person's reaction makes sense, because it's like, wow, this is almost impossible, isn't it?
Yeah.
To be anxious about nothing. It would be perfect trust.
It would be perfect trust. Yeah. So anxiety, man, Bob, anxiety is everywhere and it's skyrocketing. And there are many, many, I think, ways to go about addressing this. This is it's a pandemic, an epidemic.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to acknowledge that as we step into this thing. It's not like we're just talking about this little side thing that affects 10 people. So anxiety. Here's a couple first thoughts. Some anxiety is healthy and normal, and it's part of design. So let's normalize a little bit. And what I mean by that is it's appropriate. Someone has a gun to your head that you would feel anxious. There's an understandable dynamic there. Is it possible to not have anxiety with a gun to your head? Yes, that would require heroic virtue, but it is possible. So some of it I would just want to normalize for people, because I think the scrupulosity and the anxiety go hand in hand, and you're telling me to do this one thing, but I don't, and I don't know how to integrate them all. I would say the next thing that comes to mind with regard to anxiety would be, it's once again a relational dynamic. And there's a lot of factors that go into this on, I'll call it the natural level. Sister Miriam is the first one who put me onto this concept of the baseline for a child's kind of emotional, where's emotional baseline? It starts in utero with the emotions of the mom and the regulation of the mom's heartbeat. So, I mean, we're talking about stuff that goes really early and really deep. So I just want to normalize and set some stage. And then I think some people on a natural level are more prone to anxiety than others. And those are maybe some things that just maybe on a temperament level and whatnot. However, all that established, there is massive freedom from anxiety as well. So
yeah,
I'll hit the ball back to you.
All right. So good. So I will recommend the book that I was just referring to, Searching for and Maintaining Peace. It is outstanding. By Father Jacques Philippe. We're doing it as a team at work and talking about it every week. And I also have a fellowship group that's going through it. And I have, I've talked often about having panic attacks in the past and anxiety. And it's that's anxiety on a big scale. I wouldn't have any awareness of anxiety until these panic attacks would hit. Now I don't have panic attacks, but I'm aware of very subtle movements of anxiety in my heart. And I would say anxiety is the opposite of security. So when you're talking about being in the mother's womb, that it's the symptom of places where I don't feel secure. And it's often a symptom of where my wounds are. Anxiety is a feeling of threat that we can't identify. And so often the hidden wounds are the ones that surface in anxiety. But as I've been reading this book, and he makes the statement of nothing and no one around you can cause you to be afraid or to lose your peace.
It's a bold statement.
Yeah, it's a bold statement. And then he acknowledges, but it takes a great deal of spiritual freedom and maturity to get there, and emotional freedom. So as you're saying, let's normalize it. We all have anxiety. We all have feelings of threat. It's a warning system in our souls, in our bodies that God gave us to tell us whether it's real or not, whether the threat is real or not, that there's a threat. And so it's in our amygdala. There's that kind of reaction. Some of us get stuck there in patterns of anxiety, and scrupulosity would be an example of that. But for all of us, we have anxiety. And I'll just share an experience of being in a situation the other day that I would have not been aware without reading this book that I was anxious in the situation. It felt so normal for me to react internally the way I was reacting, but it was a situation where there was a potential conflict where one or the other person or both of them could get hurt, and I was present, and I was the only one aware that one or the other of them could get hurt. And so my anxiety started to come up, and I started to want to fix it, like protect them from the situation. And then I realized, it's okay. I don't, again, I'm remembering this isn't my responsibility. I can be present. I can be sensitive, but I don't need to make this better. And all of a sudden the anxiety started coming down. So just in that small way of us coming to know ourselves and becoming aware of what's creating the anxiety. And then how do I turn to the Lord in that and then get security again and let go of. It took me a little while for my system to calm down, but it was okay. And so I'm really becoming aware of just the little places. I used to only be aware of the really big places of anxiety, and now getting aware of the littler places is really helpful to just come back to peace.
It reminds me of, when you're gardening, if you take care of a weed when it's small, it's easier to pull out than when it's like a tree, So Man, there's so much that you're saying there. I think that's so good. I'm going to spin off a little bit because the topic is so big. So I'm going to throw a curveball at both of us.
All right.
Does the healing process that we talk about address everything? And this is a hard question in my own mind, but I think it matters. I think it's an important thing for us to just navigate. And I don't think, I haven't thought through this question, but I think it's important because in our immaturity, I'll speak for myself. In my immaturity, I look for silver bullets all the time. I look for, give me the answer, and I want it to work with everything. And one of the things that I think can happen is I do a lot of all or nothing stuff. That can't be addressed by the healing process. That can be either or, all or nothing. Oh, it's just my temperament. That'll never get better. So I want us to step into that so that people can hopefully have a little bit more maturity in these domains. Does this make sense what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's a good question. I'm thinking of a podcast that Matt Fradd did with your spiritual director, Father Boniface.
Yeah.
And they just addressed this issue in a different way.
I did. Okay.
So
cool.
Just refer people to that.
Yeah.
But I would say just in the same way that we're saying it's possible to not be anxious with somebody with a gun to your head, mm-hmm. that takes a great deal of interior freedom to get there.
Yes.
And is the healing process that we describe a road to interior freedom? Yes. And I think it applies across the board. All the teachings of the church are the road to that. All the sacraments are.
That's good.
However, if we put an expectation that I'm going to receive the Eucharist and all of my anxiety is going to go away, or if I pray a rosary and all my anxiety is going to go away, or if I submit every thought and imagination to Jesus, all my anxiety is going to go away. I think that's getting into scrupulosity. I think that's getting into perfectionism. And so it's not a matter so much of what's available to us in healing, because I think they're tried and true.
Yes.
It's how we approach them and what we expect of them and our docility to the Holy Spirit to grow in maturity rather than to demand ourselves to have healing in everything immediately. That's what I would say to that.
Yeah, I'm going to take it a step further and be a bit more just controversial.
Okay.
And so I'm going to say the healing process as we describe it does not address everything. And let me explain. Healing doesn't automatically do maturing for you.
Okay.
And so the reason I'm nuancing them, and this
That's
is
good.
I'm purposely poking the issue. I'm distinguishing them, although someone could see them as interconnected, healing and maturity. I would say that they are deeply interconnected, but we have to nuance. Otherwise, we fail to appreciate each in their own right.
Right.
Healing, like getting through to where I'm not distrustful of everyone, is extremely important. But maturing in the art of loving well, the healing process isn't necessarily, that's not its design and intention. However, it has tons of overlap. For example, connection with Jesus.
Right.
That's the heartbeat of the healing process, but it's also the heartbeat of maturing.
Right.
It's also like relationship is the key fundamental dynamic in healing, but also in maturing. And I think that's where it can start to get foggy about what's what. I think it's just a really important thing to emphasize, just like what you said. I did the act, I did the process, it didn't work. It must be, then the process must not work.
Right.
And it could be a whole bunch of other reasons, openness on the part of the person doing it, that's not how the process works, things take time. All of that to me matters.
Let me bring that back to you then in terms of anxiety.
Good.
How would healing address anxiety, and how would maturity address anxiety?
That's a great question. My initial reaction would be both at the same time. They're working both at the same time on different aspects of the same issue. So I struggle with anxiety, and my anxiety is rooted in, I'm very sure of it. My anxiety is rooted in a lot of formative experiences in my life. And I learned the world isn't a safe place and you can't always trust people. Now, the degree to which that is present in me has come from wounds. And if I don't ever address those specific wounds, I will perpetually be in this pattern of the world isn't safe, etc. But there's a maturing that comes in to be able to determine maybe this person isn't actually safe, and I don't necessarily need, if I'm around a sociopath and their desire is to murder me, that is true that this person isn't safe, and it's probably healthy for me to be intentional and careful with how I interact with them. So how do I care for that person sitting in front of me? I have to learn how to do that better. And if I don't learn how to do that better, I should feel anxious and concerned and worried because of the person that's in front of me. But what this is how I would define it. In the healing process, I'm trying to repair all the stuff that was never God's intention. In other words, the result of sin. Mm-hmm. Sin done unto me, the sin of omission and the sin of commission. That is primarily, in my mind, where the healing process specifically, and I'm being very specific about the healing process, dealing with vows and beliefs and wounds. So I'll narrow in on that. But Jesus didn't sin, and yet he needed to mature. And we see this all through his life. So he grew in wisdom and stature and favor. And so there's a maturing process that's completely separate from the healing process. I feel like I'm kind of doing I feel like I just was on the presidential debate and you asked me a question and I gave you a roundabout answer. If I'm honest, that's what it feels like.
Well, let me bring that question back to the scrupulosity and anxiety connection. Okay. So I'll just start it and then you can finish it.
Okay.
So if scrupulosity is rooted in maybe temperament, but also in experiences of shame and fear, and creates a lot of anxiety. And then the anxiety drives the scrupulosity, and the scrupulosity then drives the anxiety, and it gets into a loop. What does maturity look like there? And what does healing look like there?
What do you think, Bob? That's a good question.
I think maturity is being attentive to what's going on.
Yes.
Learning to love yourself and those parts of you. That's also healing, but learning to love yourself. Learning to choose differently in the situation where the anxiety comes rather than to do the compulsive, obsessive acts. All that can come with maturity, but that also depends on healing and freedom and those. So they go kind of hand in hand.
Yeah, I would agree. They definitely go hand in hand. I think my original intention with asking the question is what I would never want someone to come away with in listening to the podcast is, just do the healing process. That's it. That accomplishes everything. And I think that would be a really dangerous conclusion from listening to us, because the development of virtue is intimately connected to healing, but it is its own domain. They go deeply hand in hand, and there's lots of overlap. But if you don't distinguish them, then here's something that I think I get concerned about, is that people would not realize that you don't heal your way into maturing and charity. Mm. Like there's some real just basic practice, just like on a sports team. Like if I have a rolled ankle, that ankle needs to be healed, but that healing of the ankle won't make me automatically learn how to run well or to jump higher.
Right.
There's a development that goes into it. Yeah. And it would be misleading to think that, this one thing does all, although there are components of that one thing that transcend the domain of healing, like prayer and intimacy with Jesus.
Yeah, and I would say that there's a lot of ways that healing takes place. There's a lot of ways that we mature in those situations by developing different virtues and exercising our will in different ways. But
Agreed.
It's the security, maturity, purity. It's,
yes,
the healing allows us more freedom to make those choices.
Absolutely. And it can be so much so, and I would argue that this is actually really common, that there's so much need for healing that the maturity is dramatically impeded. And people make very little progress because there's so much need of healing.
Yeah.
And here's what I would argue on the flip side. Oh, you don't need healing. You can just mature. And I would say, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's the case.
I agree with that. I just want to add one other thing. I know there's a lot of debate within Catholic Christian circles about when and how medication should be used.
Yeah.
But a lot of times I find that in situations with anxiety, only by my own experience, I know this, that I remember one time that my anxiety was so bad, I went to the emergency room. I thought I was having a heart attack, and my heart was fine.
Yeah.
And what did they do? They prescribed anti-anxiety medication.
Yeah.
And then they almost forced it on me. They said it's going to be malpractice on my part if I don't take them. Wow. Well, I've had doctors tell me that those are some of the worst medications, and they actually create more anxiety in the feedback loop. And so I knew not to take them. However, what that meant is that I had to have the maturity to stand in the face of that anxiety the next time, rather than pop a pill in there to get rid of it. And, we can use anything there. You put food in there, or drink something in there. Or, we do all kind of things to manage our anxiety.
Yep.
So maturity is making different choices in those moments.
Yes.
And being willing to feel the pain of the situation.
Yes.
Rather than getting comforted right away. I think that's also part of the healing process, but it's maturing to do that.
I would, this is interesting. You and I have had this discussion outside of this domain. I would also argue that there are times where the medication is good and helpful to the person, because sometimes you have so much anxiety and so little maturity, you need something to put you at least put you in a situation where you even have an opportunity to grow or an opportunity to mature. Like, people can be so overwhelmed. I think the point you're making, well, you correct me if I'm wrong, medication isn't healing.
Correct.
It's an aid to a process to hopefully put someone in a situation to where they could engage in a healing process and not just be crushed by the dynamics that are going on. I don't think that medication is the answer, because that's where I think it can get problematic and misleading. Take this medication, you're good to go. Well, the research and the psychological research says medication alone isn't as effective as therapy, and we can include the healing process there, as therapy and medication. Neither one of those by themselves are as effective as the combination of the two. The point is, though, some people can say that medication is healing, and like, man, that's way easier than having to learn how to mature and use my will. I'll just do this and keep increasing the doses as my brain gets into tolerance levels for those things. Because I wouldn't want to send the message to people, if you're on medication, you're doing something wrong or bad, get off that right away. That'd be very dangerous. Are all the medications good? No, they're not all good. Some of them are more helpful than others, and you work closely with your doctors in that.
Right.
In
good
that
balance.
domain. Yeah. Is there more there you would say about that?
I think that's good. I think it's a good place to move on. Well, we got to stop here.
Let's land the plane there. We got about halfway through our list. So listeners, this is cool. We appreciate your questions. You can see that we actually, we put them all together and read through them. And some of them are great for a series, and some of them are great for an episode, and some of them we'll do here. So please keep sending in your questions. It's fun. It gives Bob and I just a different way to do the podcast. I think it's awesome. And Bob, anything else?
No, I just the encouragement, I think, with all of this is just our openness, just the openness of heart, and just being willing to stretch, to grow, to heal, and to be that for others.
Yeah. I think the thing I want to say is I would want to say to our listeners, like, showing up to listen to this podcast isn't like a back rub. You know what I mean? Like, it's not like, oh, that was so nice. It's hard. It's not easy. So I just want to say, good job, listeners. Like, continuing to show up to this stuff is like a continual commitment to your growth and your development and your healing and your maturity. So well done. Good job. We're in it with you. Yeah. We hope it blesses you, and we'll talk to you again next time.